place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we are meeting today, and in the air, which is transmitting the bytes of information. And we are very, very happy to have Guy Rouleau with us today. Dr. Rouleau is the director of the Neuro and the co-founder of the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute. And among Dr. Rouleau's many accolades, in 2020, Dr. Rouleau was recognized with Canada's highest civilian honor, the Order of Canada, for his outstanding contributions as a clinician scientist and as a leader in healthcare. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Rouleau to help us kick off this new series on open science best practices.
Well, thank you very much. So hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this workshop on how to write your neuroimaging data management plan in 15 minutes. Catchy title. This is the first of a new series organized by the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute on best practices in open science. So research data management, RDM for short, has become a field of its own in recent years. RDM is crucial to open science and good research practices in general. The CIHR and tri-agencies have released their long-awaited policy on research data management. This guidance will help Canadian institutions to adopt consistent practices when working with data. And that's something that's very easy to say, but harder to put into practice, as some of you have learned the fun way. So data management plans, as you'll learn in this workshop, are one method for opening up silos of information that stay hidden within small teams. That opening can help bring about productivity gains and unlock the collaborative potential that is a promise of open science. As neuroscientists, we're all working to understand the brain and accelerate the discovery of new treatments and cures for neurological diseases. So the Neuro is recommending that all labs at our institution use data management plans, not only because they are recommended by the funders, which they are, but because they can save us a lot of time that we would rather spend doing something else like our science. So we're very pleased to welcome today Dr. Elisa Rudd, who's an expert on research data management from McGill Libraries. And I'll just mention that libraries and librarians are very strong supporters of open science across the world. And they were doing this much, before we started at the Neuro. And so it's very fitting that we hear from somebody at the McGill Libraries. I also want to thank Ted Strauss for organizing today's session. Ted recently joined TOSI as the data management and sharing coordinator. So thank you all, and I hope that you have a very informative workshop.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rouleau. Before I turn things over to Elisa Rudd, I just wanted to have a few preliminary slides to sort of set the stage. We are on the technical side, I would just mention we're on the Zoom meeting right now. Feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions. We will have time at the end for questions, and if there's anything you need clarification about, we'll be monitoring the chat and can respond. And please keep yourself muted for the sake of audio. And so to set the stage a little, well, first I wanted to acknowledge that the organizers of today's workshop and the Open Science Best Practices series that we're beginning are from the Neuro, the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute, and McConnell Brain Imaging Center, which are part of the Neuro, as well as the Portage Network and McGill Libraries, of course, which Elisa Rudd is part of. And just for your information, the Portage Network is kind of in transition to becoming part of NGRIO, and that's something that Canadian research institutions will be hearing a lot about in coming months. So as many of you will know, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, the tri-agency funders released their long-awaited policy on research data management. And that policy, as many expected, it does include requirements related to research data management data management plans, which is the focus of today, and data deposit. And those are things that the NIH and in the US had already formalized as a policy. In addition, that policy is aligned with data deposit requirements in the Tri-Agency Open Access Policy on Publications, Health Research and Health-Related Data Frameworks, and these other initiatives. And so it's important to understand that the Tri-Agency sees these practices as extremely helpful, and this is part of a large plan. And the DMPs that we're focusing on today are just one piece of that. And that one piece, I did want to highlight the specific language that it says. So I'm going to go ahead and read this out loud. This is section 3.2 of their policy on data management plans. All grant proposals submitted to the agencies should include methodologies that reflect best practices in research data management. For certain funding opportunities, the agencies will require data management plans to be submitted to the appropriate agency at the time of application. DMPs are living documents, and the content and length of DMPs depend on the project, but all DMPs should describe how data will be collected, documented, formatted, protected, preserved, how data sets will be used, and what new data will be created over the course of the project, whether and how data will be shared, and where data will be deposited. So that's the policy, or one piece of it. And when speaking about DMPs with labs and researchers, some questions come up frequently. So I did want to try to clarify a few things just to head those off from the start. So this DMP requirement, it will be phased in over time. So it's not like everybody needs to rush out and do this like today. DMPs are living documents. So that means that it's expected and it's meant to evolve and change over time. And the first pass, the first version, can definitely be done in 15 minutes, which is what we're going to show today. But over time, labs and researchers will update and change their DMPs. Writing a DMP does not imply data sharing, but it is a helpful tool to plan for data sharing if that is part of the project that you're doing. So this presentation is part of the Open Science Institute, but that doesn't mean that all DMPs reflect data sharing. Right now, there's no established rubric or evaluation method for evaluating a DMP. So currently, what's recommended is to create them, but over time, the ways of evaluating them will be evolving. And certainly, there's no specific rubric being applied at this time. DMPs are recommended by the Tri-Agency, the McGill Libraries, and the Neuro. So it's been recommended for a while and continues to be. And when using the Dmp Assistant tool that we'll be seeing today, researchers, just so you know, are always in control of who accesses that DMP. And that tool is not used to sort of publish a DMP for public dissemination. It's really to create it and share it internally. And we're not looking for DMPs to kind of be out there in the world. It's more of an internal tool. And a little bit more specific guidance about if you are a PI at the Neuro or in a lab, what we specifically can recommend is that you should use the Dmp Assistant tool that we'll be seeing today, and use it to share your DMP within your team. So similar to Google Docs or a tool like that, you can just invite people to access it and see it and maybe contribute to it. So it's a way to give groups of people access to a template. For research that includes neuroimaging or medical imaging, we do recommend that you use the neuroimaging template that we'll be working with today. PIs and team leaders should encourage their lab members to become proficient in DMPs so that the burden is not on you specifically. And you can also delegate this to members of your team or support staff if you have access to that. And I am support staff for the Neuro. So if you need specific assistance, you can absolutely reach out to me by email, and I'll be glad to work with you to help you develop your DMPs. And just a quick note looking to the future, I didn't even finish this bullet, but the Neuro may decide to try to use DMPs as a format to request compute resources, because that's one of the things that is included. Or we may use it to as part of an ethics application, or we may use it to track trends in how labs are doing certain things. So DMPs could have many applications beyond just planning your specific project. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Elisa Rudd, who received her PhD from University of California, Santa Barbara in 2012, and is McGill's authority on research data management. Thank you, Elisa, for joining us.
Thanks, Ted. I'm going to dive right in. I'll cover a few of the topics that Ted mentioned as well. I think a lot of that bears repeating. We're in a new landscape with the policy, so just to make sure that everyone's aware about, what the purpose is of DMPs and what the funding perspective is, and sort of what we in the community of information professionals also have developed to sort of assist researchers in going through this process. So I'll cover, what is a DMP at a high level, what's the incentive to write a DMP, where does data management fit in the workflow of a research project, sort of think about the big picture of, what kind of topics come up in a DMP and what's relevant. What content goes into a DMP specifically, and then we will turn toward the Portage Dmp Assistant tool and go through it together. And I'm not going to time us for 15 minutes, but I will say that it will be about 15 minutes or less to create that sort of first version DMP, which is perfectly reasonable. So what is a data management plan? So it's basically a document or documentation. It's part of the documentation for a research project, much like you would have a code book, for example, or other kinds of documentation that would outline what you did during your project so that others can reproduce that work and understand what you did transparently. So this sort of plays into the open science practices regarding transparency of research. So it outlines the tools, methods, strategies, procedures that you're going to use to manage your research data. And this could be very specific or it could be pretty general. So it depends on the project and the kind of work you're doing, what makes sense for you. It's a plan that covers sort of as you're going through active data collection, so the phase of your research where you're actually conducting the research itself, but also thinking about in the future, what will you do when you wrap up your project? So having a plan for that at the beginning so that you can ensure that, for example, if there's, very specifically, if you need to have some language in your consent forms so that you can later do something with those data, you want to make sure upfront that you've thought of all those options. And it's a living document, as Ted mentioned before. This means that you'll version it. You'll go through multiple drafts, and that's fine, because at the beginning of a project, you may not know all of the tools that you intend to use. You may not have identified all of the procedures that you're going to follow or all of the components of your project. Things change over time. So it's fine to go back and update it and sort of fill in those details as you go. So you think of it as not something that you have to know everything up front, in very specific details, but rather just you want a high level at the beginning, and then you want to go back and revisit it at points in your project where it makes sense. So what's the incentive? Why should I do it? It's useful. So, normally we're sort of advocating for these best practices because they're useful in the research process, or they're useful for the research community as a whole. Useful in this context sort of means it's a best practice. We look across the landscape of how complex research has become over the past decade, 2 decades. And each year, more and more data are collected. And there's really a need to sort of keep track of this and think about, in a very intentional way, how are we going to deal with all this data that we're creating? So that's where the best practice comes in, and it creates some transparency around your process. So it plays into the open science movement as well. And it's practical. If your study is taking place over several years, you may not remember exactly what you had intended to do, in 3 years, 4 years at the beginning of your project. This is a nice way of sort of laying it out in advance, revisiting it later, and saying, "Aha, I know exactly what I meant to do because I wrote it down." So, it's a project management tool at a very high level. And as Ted mentioned, we also have to write them because we'll probably be required to write them. So funding agencies, both in Canada and internationally, have shifted to requiring DMPs in the adjudication process of grants, meaning that they expect you to attach a sort of 1 to 2 page document that just outlines all of these issues related to your data during your project. And ethics boards across Canada have also are more and more asking to see the data management plan because it really underlies a lot of the ethical concerns about the way that data are stored involving human participants and the way that data might be shared. So these are documents that may be required at some point to be attached to ethics board protocols if there's an intention to share the data broadly or openly. So something to consider. And where does it fit in the research data lifecycle? What does that look like? So research data management specialists and librarians have been researchers doing research for a long time now. That's what we publish on. That's what we go to conferences about and talk about, like all the researchers we study and what they're doing. And we've tried to distill all that information into a sort of, sort of concise tools that explain like what is this process and what things are involved in each step of these processes. And basically the data life cycle for research projects, it's cyclical. Like, you create some data, you download it, you store it, you collaborate with your team, you analyze it, you have to manage it, you have to at some point share or publish it potentially. You then want people to discover it and reuse it theoretically. And you want people to cite you for sure. I think that's a universal incentive. And then, that starts all over. If you are also reusing data from another study or, looking to other studies and what they've done, this can inform the process of planning your next study. So it's, it's going around and around forever and ever. And to sort of distill that into like very practical notions of what does that mean for me? So it means before you start your study, you want to sort of think about the data management plan aspect, and you want to think about ethics if you're working with animals or humans, for example. So it's the same idea. You would have to plan for the ethics involved, the issues involved with ethical concerns related to humans or animals during a project. You have to do that up front, and you'd have to make some guarantees. And so we're sort of saying that this is the same kind of idea that should apply to data because it can be just like a huge and complex process during the project. And then during your project, you want to think practically about like where are you storing it? Are you backing up the data? What kind of documentation do you need to keep so that you or others can reproduce that research? And then after, there's considerations about sharing, publishing the data. So are you making the data open? At the very least, are we archiving, preserving it for a given number of years or indefinitely? And then what kind of machine readable metadata should we apply? So I'm not going to get too far into that today, but just there are other considerations about the infrastructure of connecting data that's been produced for a project with studies that are relevant to those data, and how do people find those when they're looking for projects or data? So what content? I think Ted covered this from the RDM policy, but in general, it's also it's very high level. What's your study about? What kind of data are you collecting? And this can be, and this really is just like what format are those files in? What instrument are you using? And it can be very general or it can be very detailed. So where are you going to store the data? Are you going to make it available, or are you not going to make it available? And what's your justification for that? And then where are you going to archive or preserve those data if you intend to do that? Okay, so there's some tools. I'm going to switch my screen and go to the Portage Dmp Assistant in a minute, but I'll just go through the other tools that exist, and I will drop a link to these slides into the chat when I finish talking, so you have the links. But Portage has created a lot of like one-page guides and primers that are pretty useful, so I've linked to that. There's a DMP online tool in the United Kingdom for UK and Europe-based grants. It sort of follows what's required in those funding agencies over there. And then there's the DMP tool from the United States. And honestly, all of these sort of aggregate the same questions. They're all going to cover the same topics. So it's not, necessarily a big deal whether you use one or the other, but it depends potentially on what funder you're going after. So if you're going on NIH funding, maybe you want to turn to the US tool, for example. If you're going for tri-agencies, you'd probably want to look to the Portage Dmp Assistant, which was built here in Canada for, thinking about researchers in Canada. Okay, I'm going to, bear with me while I switch my screen to the Dmp Assistant, and I'm going to drop this link into the chat. So this is the link to the Dmp Assistant. So this is what it looks like. It's when you go to create an account, you would click on create account, and you would see that you enter your first name, last name, your email. You would want to sign up based on your organization, your institution. So in our case, it would be McGill. So I would type it in, select it, select my password, because actually this doesn't link to any kind of single sign-on through our authentication system. So you're just creating your account, but you want to sort of link back to your organization so that you get all the advice or the guidance that's relevant to researchers here in Quebec at McGill. And then you can go ahead and create your account. But since I have an account, I will sign in. I'm going to let folks have a few seconds to create an account if you would like to. I'm going to demo a few of the features of the Dmp Assistant, but if you'd like to follow along and you're like ready to write your Dmp in 15 minutes, you can definitely do it during this workshop. So if you want to go ahead and create an account, feel free. So I'll sign in. And you will see your dashboard when you sign in. If you signed up with McGill, you'll see the McGill logo here. If you had created more than one DMP, you would sort of see a list. I have a very nice shared example here from one of your colleagues, Ovidio, who I'll point to this after we go through sort of the blank template, but we have a lovely example that's been shared for this workshop. You can toggle languages, so it's a fully bilingual tool, which is really nice. So up at the top right-hand side, you can click language and switch to French. So I should note, we're going to look at the neuroimaging and neurosciences template that actually TED authored and was recently launched in the tool. So in general, there's a default template that has a series of questions that should be relevant to sort of most people doing research. It's very, very general, but the neuroimaging template is very specific to folks doing work in the neurosciences, and TED authored it. So just a shout out to TED. It's an incredible template. And that will be, and so I wanted to point out too that has been pushed to the McGill's Portage Dmp Assistant instance this week, and they're still actually working on the translation into French, so that should be up soon. But don't be concerned if you go to try to create one and it doesn't, there's certain parts of it that haven't been translated yet. So just so you know. So if I wanted to create a new plan, I would go ahead and click create plan. So if you would have to go to my dashboard, you would click the dashboard. There's several ways. There's create plans is all over the place. You can click it in multiple locations. So you would go to create a new plan. What research project? So here would be like the title of your research project. I'm going to say it's a mock project for testing. So that sort of allows me to not write a title, or it's going to give me a default title. But if you have your own, if you have the title of the project, you put it there. You would want to select McGill University as your institution or your organization, and that will allow us to select from the DMP template list, the drop-down list, the neuroimaging templates. That's only available right now in McGill University's instance. It will be pushed to the rest of the institutions across Canada very shortly, as soon as that translation is finished. I'm going to show you, actually, we can go ahead and click the neuroimaging template. I'm going to say create plan. So it'll bring you to the project details page. You'll see that there's project details, a plan overview, a phase 1, a phase 2. You can share it, and you can sort of decide how you want to share it. And mostly that's so that you can share it among your lab members, or a data manager like TED, for example. So you would make sure that the visibility makes sense. So you can make your DMPs public. I don't think there's many people who necessarily are doing that. It's not meant to be a repository where you share these kinds of documents, but if you're willing to share and you feel like it would be cool if someone searched around and found yours and was happy to see an example, then you're definitely welcome to do that. You can set it at the organization level, meaning that anyone at McGill could see it, or you can restrict it to yourself and just people that you specifically invite. And then you have the option of having a test one where it's not visible. You can put your funder, grant number, the abstract of your project. You can put the contact information. So pretty basic, high level information. You would go to plan overview to see what exactly is this template covering. So there's a phase 1 and a phase 2. You can do phase 1 in 15 minutes. That's sort of the context of this workshop, is that your first pass, your first draft of it, where you're just beginning to plan a research project and you may not know very specific details about, how exactly you're going to store the data, or what electronic lab notebook platform are you going to use, or product are you going to use. You may not have an exact idea, but you may know that you will use in general an electronic lab notebook, for example. So you can just say that, and that's fine. So you can look at the overview of phase 1. It says there's going to be 10 questions, 7 sections. It gives you some high-level instructions. So it's going to cover data collection, storage, preservation. Phase 2 is going to get more detailed. So we'll just take a peek at that later, but we're going to focus on phase 1 for today. So if you're following along, you can go ahead and go to phase 1. And then you'll see some sort of collapsed menus for each of these categories and how many questions are in each one. So click data collection, and what you'll see generally is that the setup is it'll have a question where you can type your own answer, click save, and it'll also have some guidance on the right-hand side. And this guidance is from that neurosciences template, right? So it's, it's guiding you, it's giving you some very specific guidance on like, what exactly are we looking for? So, it's what type of neuroimaging modalities will be used. Are you using MRI, EEG, et cetera. How many participants are you expecting to acquire images from or to collect data from? Does it have any supplemental types of data, such as like behavioral, biological? So just describe this at a very high level. And we are going to do something fun. And if you don't find it fun, please don't tell me. I would like to live under the assumption that this is fun for the rest of my life. So I'm going to pop this link into the chat, and then I'm going to ask you to sort of go to this link, and it's anonymous, so we're going to sort of fill out the first question and sort of see this together. So I'm going to give you all a couple minutes and this doesn't count toward our 15 minutes, because going outside of the Dmp Assistant and coming back, we're going to give ourselves a break with like 1 or 2 minutes. So if you go ahead and fill this out, remember this is asking you the neuroimaging modality is the guidance, whether you're collecting other kinds of data like behavioral or biological, and what's your anticipated sample size, or how many participants do you expect to have in your. Let me know if that link is not, if you're not able to type a response into the link. Is it working? I'm just going to wait you out until people start responding. So if I were answering this, I might say MRI, behavioral study collected through an assessment tool, stored as a spreadsheet, and I anticipate like 125 participants plus a control. Something like, that's the level of detail, and that might even be too detailed for this phase. All right, I'm giving 30 seconds. Maybe people are not finding this fun. Please let me know if it's not. Is it working? Someone nod their head. Ted, is it working? Okay. So as people respond, we should be able to like see them here as they show up. So that's why I'm waiting.
I submitted one as a test.
Oh.
But I think our audience is still getting warmed up today, so we can give it a minute, or we can keep going.
Yeah, that's interesting. Your response should be seen. Okay, if it's not working, then we can. I also submitted a smart response. Oh, okay. Well, technology is not working today, so we will. Oh dear. We will, that's too bad. We will skip this and go back to the general. Would people like to share in the chat what they said? Would you, if you feel comfortable, not being anonymous, that would be appreciated. What would you say here? What types of data would you be collecting? What would the sources of the data be? And what would be the sample size? Okay. Recordings from 5 animals. Great. Super specific. Awesome. fMRI, movie watching, 100 participants. Perfect. There you go. You guys, we're on track to do this in like 5 minutes, and that's fine. It can be, at this stage, it can really be like bullet points. Oh, look at all these beautiful answers. Exactly. And so all these answers that we're putting in the chat where it's like, you know, you can sort of rephrase these in like 1 or 2 sentences, that's totally fine. So let's say I'll put MRI, I'll put behavior, self-reported, behavioral, 150. See. So let's say that's my, you know, first pass answer. Like, and I might come back and I might, you know, turn this into sort of like a 1 or 2 sentence phrases, so it's not just notes, but at least I have an idea of like where I'm headed with my study. So that looks good. So we could try documentation and metadata. So the next question is about how you're going to document your methods to support reproducibility. And the guidance on the side here, it's basically hinting to you that it might be useful to use online document or folder systems such as GitHub or Zenodo or OSF, where you can sort of, you know, use that as a project management platform, a sort of cloud-based platform for that. So maybe I don't know, I think I'll probably use one of these. Maybe it's GitHub, maybe it's OSF, but I don't want to commit at this stage. So I might just write, you know, cloud-based electronic lab book notebook platform, right? Something very, so what I'm getting at here is that it's fine to be vague in the first pass of your DMP, especially if you really don't know or haven't decided. I think it's better to be vague before you know specifically than to commit yourself to something specific and then later have to change that. So that's something to think about, especially if this is something that's going to be attached to an ethics review, for example, because if you're committing to something very specific, a specific tool, then it's more of a pain to go back and change that later. For storage and backup, so how and where will your data be stored and backed up during your research project? So there's a lot of guidance on the right-hand side as well for this. So you can read through, and you're also meant to sort of provide a link or URL to the system that you plan to use. And you can just say like on site at McGill or at the MNI at the Neuro. You could say securely. So, you know, but you don't have to commit to like defining that specifically. Or if you have a go-to storage center right now that you usually use and you intend to use in the future, you can just, you know, go ahead and explain that in this question as well. I'm going to pause and see if there's any actual questions about the tool itself or any confusion about like the process of logging in or anything like that. Everyone was able to do that? Okay. So saving, and so you can see you save it, and it tells you sort of when you last responded. So if I logged out and went back and logged in again, I would see the time and date when I had last answered this question, which is useful as well. So the second question related to storage is sort of what's your anticipated, you know, size of the storage in terms of space. And so this is always good planning in advance to think about because it might dictate where you can actually store the data. So let's say I'm going to go with like 5 terabytes or something, you know, mildly reasonable. So that's it. I can just say 5 terabytes now. I can say like a range like 2 to 5, or, you know, I can be more specific about how much storage I might need. So in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, would you guys, would you folks please share, you know, what would be your expected storage, or what's your like average or typical storage that you require during the course of your project? And this can be sort of like off the top of your head. 20 gigs, 1 terabyte. So I think, yeah, normally it's going to be in this range of like 1 terabyte for imaging, 1 to a few. Would that include storage from processing, analysis, or just raw data? All of it. That's a really good question. So it would include everything that you need to store in the course of, you know, collecting your data and conducting your research, right? It's like thinking about the whole project itself. And so it's also thinking forward to like, if you're going to create a version of the data set to be shared, it also includes that version as well, if that's not the raw data. Super good question. And this is more for thinking about like the person who actually has to come up with the storage solution for the project. You know, they would need to have that information so that they could figure out what storage makes sense, right? And for long term, because like the worst thing is, you know, you start with a storage solution that you think is going to work, and then you end up collecting a lot more data, and you max out your provision, and you have to change, or you have to figure out a way to get more storage allocated, and that can be, you know, not fun, I guess, okay. So moving on for preservation. So then you think about how will you store and retain your data after the active phase of data collection? So for how long are you keeping your data? If you're working with human participants, you sort of have a sort of standard response to this, at least in the short term for, you know, there's a requirement to store it for a certain period of time. But will you be keeping that longer than 7 years, for example? You know, do you plan multiple series of publications, and how many years do you think it will take you to finalize those pieces of the project? So you can even say at this point, like, I don't know, we haven't decided, at least 7 years, but potentially longer, something like that, right? For sharing and reuse. So this is where it gets a little bit trickier, and it's, you know, at the beginning of a project, it can be more difficult to sort of have a very like firm idea of where exactly you're going to share the study or the data, how you'll share it, in what format, how open can it be. But you can have like an initial plan that I'm committed to open science, for example. So we'll try to make the data openly and freely available, you know, considering privacy and, you know, restrictions and any like legal or IP issues related to the data. So, I mean, you can at this point just describe your intention, or, you know, your viewpoint about whether data should be shared or not. Or if you have a plan, or you typically do share your data in a specific repository, you cannot say that I will share it in a data repository. You can say I'll share it in an open access data repository, or you could just leave that, you know, a little bit vague and just say a reputed data repository. So one that's, you know, recognized in my field as a place to share data.
Just a quick comment on that, Elisa. I think that at the Neuro with the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute, I think researchers, there's a sense that there's like a movement towards opening our data and sharing data, but there's also anxieties about that. And by having this DMP, it allows us to just sort of state the parameters of a project probably about 2 years in advance of when the actual sharing might occur, you know, because at the beginning of the project, before it's been collected, you have a long road before that potential sharing might occur. And so by beginning the process here, it allows us to plan together for how to do that in a very conscientious way, because the sharing is not just one thing. It can include many different activities or different tools. And so I think it can help to alleviate some of the pressure and anxiety that some researchers may have when thinking about that sharing, because it gives us a lot of lead time to think about it and plan it carefully.
Right. I think that's a super good point. I think I see that a lot with researchers who sort of get to the stage where they decide they want to share their data after their project, but they didn't have a plan in advance. And so, you know, that's a little bit, you know, that's trickier because you know, the data itself hadn't been designed for that purpose. So you have to go back and do a lot of work to sort of figure out what can be shared, or if you want to restrict access, or if you want to require like a data use agreement. So if you have an idea of this in advance, it saves you time at the end of your project. On the other hand, I've also had researchers approach me. So I manage the McGill Dataverse, which is our institutional data repository, but it right now is limited in terms of, you know, it can't host very large data sets. So I've had some folks approach me to ask if they could share their data with the Dataverse, but it, you know, the size of their data set or the parameters of their data set make it very, it's unclear at this stage, once the project had been completed, if it's the appropriate repository for them. So I, you know, if we had that discussion 2 years in advance, then at least I would have some, you know, way of informing them throughout the process of whether it was going to work out or not, or at least allocate that space in advance and realize that, okay, if I take this project, you know, because I have a finite amount of storage for Dataverse, but I'm willing to take this project because they contacted me in advance. But if someone contacts me last minute, maybe they won't have that space. So just something to think about, that the infrastructure, people who manage infrastructure components, they're always making these trade-offs about, you know, you know, how do I allocate this space, a limited finite amount of space? And even if that's a lot of space, it's still finite. So it's useful to know this in advance for sure. And it doesn't mean you have to share your data openly. That can definitely, I think we're moving toward that in many fields. And at some point in the future, that may be the default. But there's ways to share data without making it totally open access, for example, and that, you know, are perfectly reasonable given, you know, whatever the context of the data set involves. So I'll go quickly through the last two components of the DMP, which is responsibilities and resources. So, you know, I just identifying who's responsible for the data and who's responsible for managing data day to day. So that's typically like the lab manager or 2 or 3 folks in a lab who work on data in some way or another. So that person's name would just be here, and then, or it's their role, right? So their title. And then what resources will you require? So how do you estimate the overall cost for data management? And at this point, when I'm doing my phase 1, I might know, okay, if I have a full-time staff member, that's one way of sort of calculating like what the cost of this would be, if that's their full total job. Or if you're if you have like specific storage needs and there's costs associated with the storage, that would go into this calculation. It could be a very fuzzy estimate, or you can just say, you know, at this point, it's like we don't have a very, you know, specific cost estimate. So just depends on, you know, where you are in your planning. If you've already developed a budget for your grant, it can be helpful to just pull some of that information out and put it here as it relates to data management. And if you haven't gotten to the stage of budgeting, then it can be sort of more open-ended. And the last component is ethics and legal compliance. So this is just to sort of check the box of, have you gone through a research ethics board application, which board oversees your project, and then, you know, what's the file identifier of that application. So that should be, you know, like 2 bullet points basically. So MUHC for the neuro, and then the file identifier. And then there's a question about if the project includes sensitive data, how you ensure that it is securely managed and accessible only to approved members of the project. So this is typically like, you know, you have permission set on certain files or folders within your project, or, you know, it's the security of the storage itself. So it can be a 1-sentence response, you know, like we will control permissions for the files and the folders. Okay, and there, congratulations, you have written your DMP. So if you've just put bullet points in, you've still written your DMP. You have your phase 1 DMP, you're good to go for your study. And at some point in the future, you might come back and, you know, fill in some more details, and I'll show you what that looks like with our very generously shared example DMP. And I will go back to my dashboard to access this. Actually, I will go back and show one more thing. So once you're finished with your DMP, if you want to share it with collaborators, you would just go to the share tab. You would set the visibility to private. It would already be set to private. And then you could just type the email of your collaborators. So they would have to sign up for their own Dmp Assistant account, and then you would be able to search for them. And you would be able to give them permissions as either a co-owner, so that means they could edit and make comments and share it. An editor can't share it, but has, you know, the ability to change answers and make comments, or read only. So I've been given read only access, for example, to this example plan that I'm going to show you. And I think we have the creator of the plan, Ovidio, in the audience as well, so I might point to you and ask you how easy it was. And that's a loaded question, because the answer is going to be, it was super easy and I enjoyed it. So I'm just not, you know, to be honest, it's fine. Just putting that out there that, all right, I'll stop with that. I'll stop with biasing our guest. So
Ovidio, are you with us? Would you like to tell us how your experience was working on this?
Oh, cannot unmute.
Cannot unmute. Let me try.
And I'll,
okay, yeah, now I can speak.
Great.
I find it very useful because we have different project management tools in the lab. And I think that the DMP is a tool that helps you slice your project in what concerns the data only. So basically you extract everything related to the data from your project management and you put it in one single place. And I found that very, very useful. And it actually made me realize how much our information related to data and methods was distributed in so many places, and made me realize the need to have it all together. So that I think it's the biggest advantage of this tool. And I think it's also good for writing standard operating procedures for specific how to manage different data types, and to ensure a smooth transition in case of personnel change, like when students leave, new people coming into the lab. It's always like you have a training period, and data management would be the basis for this training. So this is the things that I found a lot useful, and also the downloading, exporting options, because you can download it and export it in PDF, in doc. So that's very flexible. I found the interface very, very easy to use.
Great, that's exactly what we wanted to hear.
Yeah, I also have some suggestions. I don't know, because as I said, I'm coming from the project management side of things. And one thing that I didn't find in the phases is something related to the progress. Like, where are we now? Because this is a living document. So I don't know whether the developers were thinking of this, like to put somewhere in the plan, are we in the data collection phase? Are we in the data analysis phase? How much has been published, or how the data has been used already? If, you know, I wonder whether this could be added later. Maybe I would find it useful, at least from a user perspective.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I know that they have thought about the issue of versioning, at least, that, like, you know, to track versions. It doesn't quite tell you exactly what stage, but it could be cool to add a sort of another tab where you can just check the box of which stage you're at, in particular in your project, you know, to track it live. I think we can definitely send that along to the developers, whether or not I'm sure they get a lot of suggestions, but I feel like this is a really good one. So we'll pass that along for sure. I think what Ted has tried to do here by authoring like a phase 1 and a phase 2 is to sort of allow for this versioning, because in the default template, it's just one phase. You know, you just go back and re-edit the same document over and over with the same questions. And I think Ted has tried to at least here allow for, you know, as you go along, you're going to come up with you're going to have more details and be able to respond to these questions in a much more detailed way. So I'll show you for phase 2. We won't go through the whole phase 2 part of the template, but I'll use Ovidio's responses as the example. And on the right-hand side under the guidance, this is what changes in phase 2. So there's the questions here are much more specific, you know, the make and model of the neuroimaging system. Whereas in the first version, the phase 1 version, it's just asking you, like, what kind of files are you, you know, what kind of neuroimaging modalities? Is it MRI, EEG? But here we're asking about the very specific make and model of the system. And then there's a additional longer series of questions about what formats will be used, standards, you know, is it incorporating external data? And so you can see here that there's a much lengthier response to the question, because at this point now, additional data or additional information is available. So when you go back to do the second part, actually another question I have is, you know, at what stage would you go back and be able to complete this second part? And this is to Ovidio. Again, where in the project did it make sense to come back and answer these questions, or where would it have made sense to come back and answer these questions?
I think as soon as you have the details, because when the project starts, you have to have the imaging sequencing details, for example. So it's hard to pinpoint a place, but definitely before data collection.
Right, okay.
At least some of the points here, some of the questions, because other questions pertain to how to share data later on. That may be not, I mean, we are not yet aware of the way I mentioned is that we plan to have like an embargo period after we collected the data to allow us to publish first and respond to our main research questions. And then we will share the data based on the available technologies and because in 3 to 4 years, probably things will evolve. So we don't know exactly where where things will be. So here I have very few details at the moment, for example.
Right, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, it can help to think about it, but yeah, I think there's a lot of projects for which it's really difficult to say in advance. But I think just knowing that your intention is to share raw data, I think is helpful to know at the beginning of a project, for example.
Just a quick comment. Yeah, part of the reasoning behind having a phase 1 and a phase 2 is that in neuroimaging studies, the informatics aspect is much greater than in a lot of fields, and the complexity of the details of the data preparation are a whole workflow in addition to the scientific questions. And so to me, that justifies having the separate phase where a lot of those details can get spelled out over time.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's true for a lot of fields, but I think, this is a much more flexible way of approaching it, I think. Okay, and I think I'm gonna just sort of show the rest of the phase 2 questions as the same questions, but there's further guidance is basically the idea. So the guidance on the right-hand side will change from phase 1 to phase 2. And you can always go back if you want an overview to the plan overview, which will outline both the questions in phase 1 and phase 2 and what the additional guidance will be. So you can see this in advance before you start using the template. And then I think we're at the Q&A phase. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen, or I can keep this up in case anyone has questions about the tool specifically. And thank you very much. And if you did, fill this out as we were talking, you did your DMP. And if you didn't, it might even take you like 5 minutes to do it. So definitely, useful and not extremely time consuming is what I would say are the takeaways. And thank you. Okay, so the first question I see in the chat is, will the granting agencies or IRBs require only the phase 1 or both phases? So what I don't think that they're just requiring a document. So I think, honestly, I've seen, data management plans as short as half a page be attached to grants. It depends on, what you know when you're applying for the grant. So I think they just want to see that you've thought about each of these topics at the stage where you're applying for the grant. And so whatever one is relevant, if you already know all of the details for phase 2, you could attach that one. But typically I would say that phase 1 is going to be the more reasonable approach for drafting one for a grant application. Yes, and Ted has mentioned to feel free to unmute yourselves and use the raise hand feature if you want to ask a question or raise a comment. Or if you can't unmute yourself, let us know and we can try to unmute you as well.
Yeah, and while we're waiting for questions, maybe Elisa, you could just browse down the phase 2 and just leave the screen share fixed so we have a moment to just read the specific questions a little bit more. Just so we can see those more detailed questions.
So
here's the example.
Right. Does this make sense right here, the way it's?
Let's go down to the next question. So this question, what conventions, methods, and standards will be used to structure name and version control your files to help you and others better understand how your data are organized? In other words, what types of metadata are being stored alongside the acquisition data? In neurosciences, the BIDS data format is becoming very well established. So an answer there could simply be using the BIDS format. And that would alert the technical support to know that that project may need help with BIDS conversion, or we could use the BIDS data validator to verify that data are being converted properly. Let's go to the next one.
Oh, and actually a note about this as well, for sharing data, eventually some repositories, so for example, the Dataverse, it does maintain directory structures of the original files. So if someone went to download the data, they would have, I'm thinking specifically of the BIDS format, you would have that directory structure maintained, but it doesn't display the directory structure on the interface, on the user interface. So just something to be aware of is that if you're using, this kind of file format and structure, you would also have to maybe explain, if you're using a repository like the Dataverse, that when they download it, it's going to be fine, but they won't be able to view it in the correct file order on the interface itself. And then perhaps that might make it not, an ideal repository for certain reasons, but just something to be aware about, that if you're thinking about this in advance, it makes it easier to narrow down in the end where you can publish the data. Okay, and here's the next question.
Yeah, so regarding data sharing in the neuroscience, because we have human subject data, opening up data is not a straightforward, matter, and anonymization is important to converting the data to an anonymous format. So that's highlighted as a specific question in this DMP template.
And if anyone has questions, feel free to ask at this point.
But while we wrap up, it's great that we finished in plenty of time. Maybe just as a quick feeler to the crowd, could you write into the chat on a scale of 1 to 5 how likely you think you are to producing a DMP in the next 6 months, with 5 being definitely and 1 being not going to make a DMP? That'll help.
Some 5s and a 4.
Okay.
Okay.
That's good.
And then there's silence from everyone else, which might mean that they're lower on the scale. That's fine.
Well, that's great. I think that lets us know that this is on the right track. We are going to do another session in 4 weeks from now, and we'll probably open up the registration. So if between now and then you do some work on your DMP, you could come and share that in the next session or bring any questions you have. Thanks everyone for joining us today.
I think we'll hang around for a few minutes if anyone has questions, so feel free. But I think that's the end of my presentation. It's basically this tool. It's easy to use. We went through it quickly, and you can too. Idea.
Yeah, and we can also hang out in the Zoom session and use breakout rooms to have a quick consultation if anyone wants to, just check in about this privately. I could meet with you. Yeah, thanks everyone. And this session will be published to the YouTube, the Neuros YouTube channel, so we'll be sharing that.
Oh, I love all these thank yous. I want to say, flattery definitely works on me, so thanks.
I want to fade in the music that we had, to have that kind of rolling credits feel. Elisa, can we go to the next item in the phase 2 just to do those again? So what form of encryption is used?
Oh, and one thing I didn't notice that you can definitely also add comments to collaborators. So on the right-hand side, you can have a series of comments and have a conversation with each other about, sort of the same way that you would mark up a document. Perhaps you could do that in this tool as well.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Ted. Sorry.
Nope. That's great. Yeah, it's in that way. I use Google Docs a lot in the comment feature, so I love that this kind of mirrors that workflow. And let's scroll to the next one. If you're using a data management application to manage data, please name which system. That's a big question. The decision of which software package to use in managing data is something that once the decision is made, it's very hard to change, and so that's a place where it's great to have expertise from all around the institution to weigh in and help make the best decision. Yeah, and we're at the hour here, so thanks everyone.
Thank you very much. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about your own research or how to use the tool. Okay, well.
I'm seeing a bunch more folks still on the call. Maybe it's because they've walked away, but anyways, we'll just
wait a few minutes. And thank you, Ovidio, for sharing your plan. I would say on the business term for this is that it's chef's kiss perfect DMP. You know, this is exactly what anyone would want to see, and like the level of detail and the way that it's described. I should have said that in advance. Sorry, while everyone was here, but it's really
problem.
good.
Thank you very much.
We're not evaluating them, but this one is very good. That's what I would say.
Thank you. It's a living document. It will evolve.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, I think we're down to last few people. If there's no lingering questions, you know, you can feel free to sign off. I should have shared I didn't share this link to the slides, but I wonder if there's a way to make that available at some point.
We can attach it to the web.
Okay, perfect. So I'll send those to you so that they can be attached. Cool.
Mm-hmm. Or Elisa, I'm gonna appropriate the share.
Okay,
And I'm going to share some calming Hildegard von Bingen